Hello, everybody. Welcome to podcast number 2 of This Week in Innovation. I'm Jeff Roster, former Gartner and IHL retail analyst, with my host, Brian Sathianathan, a VC and co-founder of Iterate.ai. This week, we're going to be talking about low-code and the revolution that it could cause in retail. This is a recording from a room we just did in Clubhouse just this past week. I left the audio pretty much as it was recorded because I've had a lot of questions about what it's like to work in Clubhouse. And so you can see some of the challenges that the Clubhouse offers. I left the little bumps and noises that come in because any notification on your phone actually shows up in the room. So I left that in. I thought about taking it out, but I left it in. Anyway, it's a fascinating conversation that we have. And I think low-code really does offer some really interesting opportunities for those of us in retail tech. Have a listen. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ask an Analyst. This session we'll be talking about low-code revolution in retail. I'm with my co-host, Brian Sathianathan, and we have just launched our first podcast, This Week in Innovation. It is now live on Podbean. It will hopefully be live on all the other services. It takes a few days. Brian, let me start off with giving you a definition of what I think low-code is, and feel free to correct me. My understanding is low-code is a visual approach to software development. Low-code attracts and automates every step of the application lifecycle to enable rapid delivery of a variety of software solutions. It breaks the traditional silos of business and IT to promote continuous collaboration. Increased business demand for software solutions and a shortage of skilled developers have propelled the adoption of low-code development platforms to the forefront. Now, clearly, an analyst did not write that definition, but I'll leave that to our vendor friends to come up with that. Taking out some of the fluff of that, is that sort of what we're talking about?
Yeah, Jeff, you're right. And then I think, I'll paint the picture a little bit more at a higher level, but you're right, correct. That's a very accurate, I bet it's an analyst definition, but it's an accurate definition, right? As always. You guys analysts are always very accurate, right? But let me actually take a step back and paint it a little bit from a consumer and an enterprise perspective, right? I think what's really interesting is traditionally code or software development has been a process within every organization in order to build the solutions. It always has been a build versus a buy. But if it's a build, you have to have developers and IT teams and various folks building software in the traditional form, which is basically writing code. But as the times progressed and a lot of different integrations showed up in the industry, there is a better way of doing things began to emerge. The better way of doing things is that how do we map the business process and the business activity very close to the software, right? And this is not a new concept. This effort has been going on for years. I think if you look at the early Microsoft applications, I remember when I was a kid, I started with Visual Basic, which was actually a drag and drop desktop low code platform, actually, yeah. And so on and so forth. And it began evolving over time. But I think what's interesting is where we are now is more and more organizations are figuring out how do we actually visually map, right? Instead of code, but how do we draw, right, these flows? And how do we build applications faster? And I think a couple of things are sort of, adding to why this is happening and accelerating the steps. First one is most companies on large enterprises, they want to be quick and fast and first to market. So that's one need that is driving it. And how do we become 10x faster in deploying our solutions and bringing them to market? So speed is one reason. The other is, I think, the ability to maintain and to map the business processes. That's, I think, another reason. And I think that, and I'll give you more reasons specific to retail later. But I think the third, at a very broad strokes, at a very general higher level, is also the complexity of applications have significantly increased. That what I mean by that is the number of areas or pieces an application has to connect to, different systems it has to connect to, has also increased. So this actually, through low-code, this connectivity becomes much easier because most low-code platforms are very good with integration. That makes it even easier. So all these 2 or 3 factors are making low-code more broader and easy to use in the industry.
So how long has that term been in use in, let's say, enterprise software?
I think low code, the word low code, I think has only been coined only about in the last 8 to 10 years. And in the last 4 or 5 years, it's being used more frequently and more pervasive. And now there is even market adjustments and market sizes for industry like that. You'll be quite surprised the low code market, and Gartner actually has a really nice forecast on it. In 2019 was $10.3 billion, right? $10.3 billion. And about to grow to 187 billion. I repeat, 187 billion by 2030, right? That is an 18x CAGR growth, right? 18x. That's crazy growth. So now that's becoming a market that enterprises are seriously taking a note at. And that's why we call this session a low code revolution, because this is not something, it's cool, you got to know it. There is already a significant amount of investment behind it, and it's going to grow 18 times bigger than what it is today.
I'm looking at the Gartner Magic Quadrant that was published out on the internet. So it was a legal copy I'm looking at, just in case any Gartner lawyers are listening. And the Gartner predicts from September of 2020 was by 2024, so we're a year into the prediction, low-code application development will be responsible for more than 65% of application development activity. 65%? That seems extremely high. That's your point, though.
No, I think I agree. I agree. I think it's one of the sometimes when you read these different quotes from different outlets, Gartner and Forrester, and even Microsoft and others in this space, that sometimes the numbers seem to be really high. But I think the numbers make sense, because if you look at the applications that are produced within an enterprise, they could fall into many different buckets. And in a while, I'll actually talk about what are some of the buckets that these type of applications could fall into. But if you look across all the different types of applications and the different types of buckets, those numbers are quite real, and they can become true, right? Even Microsoft made a comment saying there's going to be, the next 10 years, there's going to be 500 million apps. And there are not enough developers to build that level of apps so quickly. But then 450 million of them will be built through low code. And that's a prediction made by one of the Microsoft corporate vice presidents. So that's a public prediction, and there is several articles on it, right? So those numbers all seem to be real, because when you look at across the spectrum of the types of apps that could be built.
So I'm looking at the Magic Quadrant, and there's Salesforce is on it, Microsoft is on it, ServiceNow, Oracle, all the big names. Does low code replace existing enterprise software, or is it transition? Let's say take the retail example. We have supply chain software, we have merchandising software, we have every piece of software. Does some of that functionality move from existing applications to a low code strategy, or kind of tell me what that looks like in retail?
So I think in retail, at a higher level, I would look at 4 types of applications within retail. And this is applicable in every industry in general, but specifically in retail, there are 4 areas where low code could play in. And later on, I'll elaborate it, but just at a higher level, one is the BPM RPA, right, which is the business process management, outsourcing, and robotic process management, like things like, at a very high level, things like classifying a bunch of documents, right? Identifying POs and supplier forms and HR forms and legal forms, right? Support center type forms. All that stuff is essentially an established business across every industry, including retail. And this is where low code originally started to make its entrance. If you look at a lot of the low code providers, APN, OutSystems and all, they'll have a lot of documentation, documents and a lot of use cases in BPM, RPA cases, right? But then the second one I think is interesting, especially with the emergence of AI. You see a lot of data apps within retail, right? If you look at retail, there has to be deep customer journey analysis, spend analysis, and wallet share analysis, right? Basket type analysis, optimal carts, dynamic segmentation. All these type of things in retail will require low-code type application built up, because a lot of the people who are doing this are data experts, but they're not necessarily coders, which creates an opportunity to build more advanced applications, but much faster. One of the things in retail, the concepts that I like to focus is the concept of upskilling. I'll talk about it a little bit later, right? How can you use your existing workforce and train them? Can you upskill them to build applications quickly, right? The third area I think in retail, which I'm really interested in, is the consumer apps, which is what I'm more excited about, which is basically things like chatbots for sales, chatbots for customer services, RMA, scan and go apps, right? Things like click and collect apps, shopper guides as you walk, even like guidance apps, tell you which products it is in which aisle, right? Things like door-to-door or infinite aisle apps where you run out of products and you can scan, it will show up in your home through delivery. Very interesting. Pricing apps, right? And in the commerce angle, I think there's a lot of applications there in commerce, especially in merchandising, right? Content creation and content generation, because as e-commerce is increasing about 30%, right? 30-40% of the whole commerce share, especially with COVID, you see that as a massive accelerant. In that 30-40% increase, now suddenly you want to have your site be very special and in terms of content. And there's a lot of content generation, image generation type applications that are out there, and they're going to become more and more strong and powerful, right?
Brian, when you say this is an opportunity for a retailer to upscale their workforce, you're talking about IT professionals picking up new capabilities, or are you talking about being able other people outside of IT to learn some of these skills and migrate into the IT department?
So that's actually a great question, right? I think in my mind, I actually see like a 3 or 4 areas. First is actually IT, right? So most retailers have their IT workforce consists of some network security related stuff, and then application developers who are essentially maintaining website, building apps, right? App related stuff. So with the low code, things like AI, machine learning, IoT, blockchain, all that stuff can be abstracted. So even a web engineer can start using it. And then as in that process, they can easily become upskilled. So that's the second audience that's the first audience, I think, that will get trained. And then without hiring very expensive ML engineers, they could use existing abstracted models and components and get to market very quickly. So I think that is the first upskilling that's going to happen. Second area of upskilling is going to be data analyst and statistic teams, because most retailers have some form of teams within marketing, right, that's focused on cart analysis and merchandising and data analytics teams. They're not engineers per se, but they can begin to use more low code more deeply. And third is like anybody in the business teams and RPA, BPA teams can continue to use it more extensively. So those will be the 3 areas of propagation. One thing that I also like to, in this moment, Jeff, if you can promote Chatra as a speaker, I like to ask you a question because, just to introduce, Chatra is an AI ML expert in our company, right? Chatra has worked a lot in thinking about how to make AI and other types of innovative capabilities more accessible to low code. This is one of the problems that today retailers are facing, right? Because it's extremely hard and expensive to hire AI ML engineers. And even if you hire them, it's hard to retain them compared to fighting with Google and all the other guys. So the question is, how do you upskill the existing workforce and how can you do it more effectively? Tell us what your views are.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, so one thing I would like to highlight is in current systems, right? There is a big disconnect between the AI experts, meaning the researchers, and the implementers, meaning the engineers who actually build the product, and the stakeholders or the users of the application who usually have the data. For an example, if you think of the customer care bot, there's usually 3 parties associated with it. So the stakeholder might be like a head at the customer care department, and then you have the AI researcher side, and then you have the engineer who actually builds the application. So something which Interplay helps out is just trying to bring all these stakeholders to one platform. And starting from like the AI expert standpoint, usually, especially if you take like a smaller company, sometimes the role of engineer and the researcher is played by the actual AI expert themselves. This is speaking from experience. And so something which low-code leverages that it helps us abstract away quite a number of engineering components. So you can be ready to go, plug and play. So what this does for a AI expert is just it lets like them focus primarily on their craft. building better algorithms, tuning the data, and not worry about the engineering workload. So that really helps us actually leverage the intellectual property or actually the performance of the AI model. And it reduces the workload of the actual engineer who's doing it as well. So in addition to that, it helps the AI expert also translate their progress to the other side, the stakeholders, to easily show them. Because of the low-code platform, we can easily whip out like use cases or proof of concept at a record low time. So that basically brings those experts closer to the end product. So that's one case. And the other case is that this also leverages these experts to create a plug and play option. So then engineers like, say, web developers and other type of engineers can use these plug and play options. And if they want any like customization, then we can just talk to these AI experts again. So basically at the end, it just creates this cohesive, like very strong kind of innovation/engineering pipeline among all the parties who are in it. So that's the answer, Brian.
Thanks, Chatra. Yeah, no, I think because I love what you said. It creates a coherence between the team and also to upskill a lot of the existing team players to come to market. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And also it reduces the friction between them and reduces the number of people who associate with actually building the final product, which kind of reduces the time taken to build the product, as well as the transfer of information, say, from the stakeholder to the expert is like very short. So like usually the needs are met like quite accurately in this kind of workflow.
Brian, do we have any ROI on low code? I'm assuming it's going to be, you're going to tell me that it's probably cheaper, faster to market, all that stuff. But have we seen any real numbers yet?
So we don't have real numbers published per se outside by third parties, right? We think based on our estimates, the speed could be 10% fast, 10x faster, right? And about 40 to 50% cost efficiencies and ROI benefits. This, I think, the reason I'm saying this is because based on some of the speed improvements, time to market, and then the time that's captured between planning and that's sort of the dead time in any organizational rollouts of projects. It saves time in that area as well. So if you measure everything, you're looking at about 40 to 50% ROI benefits. It's significant. That's why this is a revolution. That's why I think, I don't know if you know this, like there are data statistics out there, like 74% of retail apps are actually hybrid apps, consumer-facing retail apps, right? And there is data on this, right? 74%, right? The reason retailers don't want to build native apps is because it's hard to convert them in low code, right? Because web apps are easy to maintain as low code apps. So there is quite a lot of low code type capabilities that the retailers and other brands are beginning to already experiment. People are seeing the benefits of it.
Where do you see that, or where do you expect that 50% savings to come from? It sounds like that's probably going to come from SI work, systems integration work.
Yeah. I think parts of it's going to come from SI work. Parts of it's going to come from just organizational efficiencies of collaborating and bringing. So like Chatra mentioned, it's going to create a coherent culture where things are going to move faster. So I think that's just sheer efficiency itself, right? The other is just time to market and other benefits. Then maintainability and extensibility. So this is another area, right? Because if you look at any low code application or even any applications you want to bring in, there are two parts to it. One is called the visible part. The other is the invisible part, right? 10% of any application, any enterprise application is the visible part. That's the user interface you see, the forms you see, the buttons you click, or whatever, the maps you get, the products you buy, whatever the standard components are. And then there is the 90%, sort of the underneath the iceberg that you never see, right? An end consumer never sees. Only the enterprise knows and the people inside the company knows what they are. And the invisible 90% often is the headache for innovation teams, right? Because that invisible 90% is where you have to have technologies in AI, ML, you have to have IoT, you have to have blockchain, you have to have a lot of data capability, you have to have tons and tons of integrations to legacy systems and pull data from your legacy data systems, or even for that matter, integrate with third-party startups. That invisible 90% is where I think the biggest value out of low code is. Because predominantly in the last 6-7 years, we've seen low code be marketed as an app development. You can go to quickly to market, quickly prototype. So basically addressing the 10% visible part, right? But I think one insight that we bring to the table and what we see here is the biggest value is not that 10%. That 10% eventually could be done by anybody. It's going to be that 90% where the biggest value for retail is going to be.
Interesting. Do you have some retail examples?
Yeah, I think a lot of retail examples. We have a lot of retail examples. But before that, I like to ask two questions. One is to Dave, right? In the invisible 90%, startups and third-party vendors are a big play in it. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about the startups there?
Brian, let me interrupt. Can you introduce Dave?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I love to. Sorry, Dave. Yeah. Dave Jenkins is the Vice President of Marketing at Iterate.ai, and he's also a senior leader and executive in the retail space. He was a CDO of backcountry.com, and he also was a leader at a Red Hat working in open source software. So he's very experienced across in this space.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah, we can, Dave. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The startups, just in the macroeconomic sense, startups are always going to be faster at finding new ideas just because of two things. One, they don't have any overhead to tell them no. And two, they're usually younger and they just take as written. The generation of startup authors now, they've always had the internet. The internet is air to them, and even open source is air to them. It's always been there. Whereas I think people who are in larger companies, they have to maneuver around, and you have to protect the order management system, or you have to protect the current Oracle deployments or whatever it is, just because, again, large enterprises fall to the sunk cost fallacy, whereas startups don't have that. So startups are, just in general, on a macroeconomic sense, startups are always going to have newer ideas faster. So the trick is to how to get those startups into the enterprise, because enterprises tend to buy from other enterprises because the buying process is easier. So how do you reduce that friction and to get startups into the enterprise? And so that's what another big element, or another big fork for us is, or another big tool for us is integrating, two things. One, how to spot those startups and sort and rank them, because out of 1 million startups, maybe only 100,000 know what they're doing. And then within that, only 10,000 actually have a viable solution, maybe. But that's just how it goes. But so so one, how to find a good startup, and then two, how to integrate startups into your existing enterprise systems as frictionless as possible. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think startups play a big part in this, and I think in this entire integration paradigm. And I think, Jeff, you also asked what sort of applications and what sort of speeds you can get benefits on. Can you also add Shamron to it? Shamron's a machine learning engineer, he also is a manager. Yeah. He's also a manager in some of the Iterate projects. He leads a few of our projects with some customers, and especially one of the things that he did recently was a very large replatforming project basically built a micro community site, all powered by low code. Shamron, can you tell us about what sort of benefits you got and so on?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear.
We can, yeah.
Okay, hey everyone. Yeah, so like Brian said, and I'm going to actually touch up on a lot of other points that were already mentioned on the call. So when we went and reskinned this whole platform via Interplay, which is a low-code platform, what we realized is two things. And these two things were one of the reasons why the process was pretty much faster compared to the regular way of doing things. So the first thing that we realized is that when you go the regular way of writing code, and I'll give you a very classic example. If you want to connect the front end to a database connection at the back, you got to have a script written for that. And that script writing time is a lot. It depends on what you're trying to do with it and how the connection should be, et cetera, et cetera. So that time dictates, that amount of time dictates when you can get over that line just to have a connection from it. But in our this particular scenario, where the whole platform that we reskinned was talking to the database frequently, like every other second, This connection that we had to do was actually done using the interplay node, which we did not have to sit and develop overnight. This is something that we already have in the platform. So we just had to worry about a small thing, what's the credentials, which database to connect to, et cetera, et cetera. So that saved up a lot of time. Like you don't have to sit and write the code to just make the database connection. And then you have to figure out why it's not working. So these nodes in the platform, they simplify the whole process 10x faster. So you just have to make sure which database you want to use and what are the credentials to the database. And then you can just connect it and go your way and do what you're going to do next. So that was one of the things that stood out and that improved our process 10x with respect to the development time. The second thing, like Dave said, we did integrate a bunch of startup services in this flow as well. So we use SendGrid for emails, we use Twilio for texting, we also use a third-party vendor, which is Whereby for video. So we have all these integrations going seamlessly through the platform as well, which if you actually try to connect them on the outside world, you have to follow their documentation, you have to see how do you make this GET request to get the service from them, and then you have to post something back to them. This whole process takes a lot of time. And since you have never worked with these startups, you have to spend a good amount of time to figure out how this works, going through the documentation, to figure out, okay, if I do this, what am I going to get next, et cetera, et cetera. But since we have these startups wrapped as nodes in our platform, this process was, I wouldn't even say 10x, it was 20x faster because we just had to get a paid account, connected via the API key, and we're rolling. We can just send the text using Twilio, done. And this is something my team added last week. The user can actually reply stop to stop getting the text. And that is also handled by Enterprise. We don't have to worry about adding that feature on the Twilio side. And that is something, if you do it outside of low-code platform, you will have to sit and write the code where if the stop comes in, what do you do on the API side? How do you tell Twilio that this person doesn't want to get text? So you stop texting them, et cetera, et cetera. So these two features of adding startups and not have to write the code to do that, or maybe switch startup capability. You don't want to use Twilio, you want to use something else. You can just switch it out, use something else. Things like that, when you're trying to reskin the platform, were very helpful because that's where the speed of dev time was super high. We were aiming to do this, and we were actually very close to it in half amount of time for that. And the same goes for UI as well. So when you have to do UI, you have to go through a bunch of pages that you have to create outside, and you have to put the code in. But we also support low-code UI. So you just drag and drop things, and you deploy, and then it gives you the code. And then you deploy it on our low-code platform. So in a bunch of places, this platform was one of the reasons why the whole reskinning process was super fast. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Shamran. That's really helpful, and also in a very practical manner, right? Not just concept, but rather at a very practical manner. You sort of walked us through the details of how it can get benefits. Over to you, Jeff. Hopefully that answered your question. It was a long answer, but hopefully we were able to capture all the nuances of the question.
So I'm sitting here fortunately, I don't have to do forecasting anymore for software spend. But if I did, do I have to create a new bucket for low code, or is that is the merchandising software spend 30% of it become driven by low code?
No, I think it's the latter, right? Low code is a bit like it's a little bit like horizontal AI. What it means is low code is across your organization and it's across your departments, right? Just like you said, there will be low code in the BPA group. There will be low code in the RPA teams. There will be low code in the data analytics teams. Consumer facing teams will have it. IT will have their low code parts as well. So there is low code that will get broken across many different areas. And think of it as more of a horizontal, and it will be rolled into your existing cost.
Okay. So more like a platform, that platform
more
spend
like a
that's
platform.
Sort of evolving.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, it's interesting, Jeff. Anybody who wants to refer it to it, I think Gartner had an interesting report. They have a low-code development technology revenue breakdown. But what they've done is they've done the breakdown across the different sections of the department, right? How much of spend is going to happen in RPA versus how much on citizen development versus how much is on management suites and all that stuff. And we can share that info out. It's just a link. We can share it out.
Well, as long as it's freely available and not a bootleg copy.
Yeah. No. It's actually a freely. You can Google it and you'll see it. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
So where are we at? Where are we with adoption on this? How early would retailers have to do? If I'm a retailer, I'm sitting here in this conversation, and I've spent 25 years or so building merchandising or supply chain software and working with supply chain software. What are my actions? What do I think about now? What kind of questions do I ask?
See, I think it's a great question, Jeff. I think a number of things you want to probably start looking at. One is first to understand, where does low code apply? What are the right use cases and the business cases where you can apply low code within your organization? Because I think that the problems that we've defined earlier, for example, the problem of getting to the market quickly, upskilling your existing workforce, right? So that your existing workforce can actually combat the new challenges created by digital, right? All those needs, I would call them the universal needs of all retailers, right? Regardless of where you are, right? Including Amazon. It's a universal need of all retailers. So now, assuming those are your needs, I think what would be good is my first advice would be to look across your organization and look at your own department, because only the CEO can look across the organization, but the individual leaders look across your department and figure out areas or use cases. Because I think it's good to think about use cases first, than thinking about a development technology or a platform. Because center everything around use cases, right? So if I am a vice president of marketing, or somebody in the vice president of innovation, or a CDO of a company, I would think about all the consumer facing use cases, right? Things like, how do I deploy scan and go apps faster? How do I do a store to door quickly? How do I do an associate helper? How do I do a navigation? Take me there apps, right? Anything that can increase my bottom line conversions, right? And how do I apply use case? In those use cases, how would I apply low code? Those will be my first steps, right? Second, I would think about low code is great, but how do I actually apply low code in a sustainable, scalable manner within an enterprise? That's a very important part of this journey, right? Because there's a lot of low code platforms that are out there, but they're all like SaaS platforms. I call them like toy platforms, right? So you are a marketing leader or a marketing team person. You want to copy some data from somewhere to somewhere. You want to format and create a table and export it to an Excel sheet. Great. That low code platform will satisfy that use case. But that same low code platform may not satisfy your use case of building a scan and go app or a click and collect app that's going to be served across 5,000 stores for 200 million transactions a year. So you want to think about that as well, because what are the applications that can actually scale? What are the applications that I can take to my IT, right? Another problem that's happening within enterprises today, and in fact, this is not a problem that happened today. It's been there for the last 10, 15 years, but it has exacerbated in the last couple of years, which is marketing leaders and business leaders. They go to IT with their needs, and then IT says, guys, great, wonderful, but get in line because we are doing a replatforming, which is going to take a year, or whatever other project that's there. So we can't attend to it. So what they do is these business leaders, they turn around, they go into their brand shop or their existing agency and say, guys, why don't you build an app? And then they build an app. They build some solution. And then they launch, because most marketing is rewarded by campaigns. And launch is done, something happens, and eventually the app is abandoned. There is no path to productionalizing the app. They take the app to the IT teams and they say, this is not ready, this is a toy. And eventually it becomes throwaway work, right? So I think what's interesting with low code is when you're selecting a low code platform, think about how can low code gracefully help you to launch something into the market, but at the same time, gracefully transition it into production, because that's an important part, because at the end of the day, something running in production and providing business continuity and sustaining business is equally important as the speed to market and launch the product. So those are the 3 or 4 things I would look at.
Yeah, so interesting. So will low code displace existing functionality in merchandising, supply chain, or will it be adopted to go after new capabilities?
It doesn't replace existing functionality. What it does is it integrates to existing functionality.
Brian, so does it replace, sure, I understand what you just said. Does it replace existing functionality or it accentuates existing functionality?
It accentuates existing functionality.
Got it. So we're not ripping and replacing anything. We're basically using this as a way of extending capabilities, probably adopting AI, some other ideas. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It is supercharging. It is supercharging what's already out there. One of the interesting, the best parallels that I would draw to low code is the same parallels that has been drawn to AI. So when this AI revolution started, I mean, AI has been there since 1950, but after they invented back propagation and AI began to, and NVIDIA started creating all these advanced chips, starting in 2009, 2010, when everybody said AI apps started increasing, AI became sort of the electricity. Everybody was afraid AI is going to take away my job. Some jobs, yes, it did. But it also increased the amount of jobs because it ended up creating all these use cases, new cases that you couldn't do before. It sort of supercharged, took everything that's existing and added AI to it, and it supercharged it. That's exactly the same thing that low-code's going to do. It's going to take everything that's there, and it's going to sort of supercharge it.
So because I reduce everything to NRF, next year when we're actually back in New York City for the show, will there be a low-code?
After you get your vaccine, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, you and my wife are going to have to drag me to that, but I think that's probably coming in my very near future. Yeah, because I'm too young to really have to worry about that. Yeah. Will there be a whole row or a whole section of low code, or will it be down in the lower or in the upper sections with the startups, or will it be down in the lowest in the basement where the smaller, younger companies are going, or will it be right on the main floor?
No, I think there'll be a few small companies in the main floor, and also some of the bigger companies in the main floor might focus on more on low code as well. Because I think what happens is some of the bigger companies are already thinking about it because they already have large enterprise apps, and they've got to this place where now they have to start providing better tool sets and integrating deeply. And they're seeing the retail shift very fast. Because earlier, retailers always wanted to go to a one-stop shop and have a one provider, easy to maintain contracts, right? Now it's changing. The retailers are seeing the digital benefits across every platform that's out there. And now there is a focus on best of breeds, right? So these bigger platform providers, the guys who basically typically are in the main floor, slowly seeing that, right? The carpets being, lifted and shifted underneath them. And then some of them do already have low-code capabilities. So they will end up providing and integrating that low-code into their custom, not into their custom, but rather into their traditional legacy stacks and providing surfacing features and functions. So you're going to see both.
Interesting. So what is in your estimation in retail, what is the state of adoption? Let's say the top 100 retailers representing $1 trillion in revenue. Of those 100, how many, and obviously that starts with Walmart and Target and all those folks, how many of those have some aspect of low code in operation today?
I think today it's probably very small. We are looking at early double digits, right? In the 18-20% adoption, 15 to 20%. This is just, I don't have numbers. This is essentially just some assessment.
You're rolling with an analyst. Right? You're rolling with an analyst now, Brian. You can just make crazy statements, and I can validate that. So no worries.
No. Sometimes we actually have. It's funny. Like at Iterate, we actually write models sometimes to come up with some of our numbers. I don't know if you know this. Like at one point in 2020, I think 2020, beginning of the year, we predicted the number of AI companies that are going to get acquired in the same year, right? And we only came short of, I think, 15 or something, right? 15 companies short. Because we do actually write models sometimes because we have a lot of ML people here, all the guys who are in here, right? Who you spoke to. So we do the thing sometimes, but this is something that we don't have proper numbers, so it's just a guess. But what's, I think, more interesting, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? In my mind, I think what's really fascinating and interesting is if you take all these industries, take insurance, take oil and gas, take defense, take healthcare, right? Now you take retail. I think retail is an industry that is super primed for low code. I'll tell you why. There are a number of reasons. First is that digital is growing faster, way faster in retail, right? Number one. Number two, every action that happens in retail, they can show direct KPI and financial benefits. That's one of the exciting things about retail as an industry, right? In a lot of the other industries, when you do take some actions, you put out an application, you can't easily show KPIs. Retail, the KPIs are very highly, nicely defined, right? Conversion, cards, engagement, all the metrics are very cleanly defined, right? So that's interesting because now if low-code apps are tied to apps that have significant KPIs, and then these low-codes are going to grow, it's going to ride that way, which I think is second, and I think what's going to be interesting. Third, I think retail, the prior stat I used, 74% of all retail applications, consumer-facing retail applications, are all hybrid. That means they are all web-based applications. Retailers have a higher number of web engineers compared to AI or other type of engineers. Like insurance has been in the data business for a very long time. Because they have to deal with actuarial tables, modelings, and everything. They have a lot of statisticians, and eventually they all transition into ML data scientists. But retailers don't have enough data scientists proportionately compared to other industries. So they have to do a lot of upskill. So low code is going to help them really fast to upskill really quickly.
Interesting. I'll have to think about that a little bit. Huh. Okay. Actually, I've been really remiss to offer questions to the audience. So if anybody has any questions, we're coming up probably another 15 or 20 minutes or so. So just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll pop you up to the stage. Wow, that's interesting, Brian. You actually think that retail will see a faster adoption of low code than the other verticals. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it may be total dollar value wise, it may be lower because some of the other insurance have heavy IT spend dollar value wise. But adoption wise, I think retail is primed for this.
They definitely, let's bring Ruben up. Definitely most other vertical have a higher percent of rev to IT, but there's 500 tier 1 retailers and 10,000 tier 2. The sheer size of the retail industry creates a whole different model.
Yeah, that is true. That's another interesting thing. That's another sexy thing about retail, right? Because it was so funny. I mean, before this, I used to be in the media industry. And then at that point, Jeff, you probably know, I invested in a couple of startups, and one of them was in the media industry as well. And you said, Brian, you should start looking at retail, right?
I remember that conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So then I didn't know anybody at retail, but finally I was on a board, and thank God I met John Nordmark. And then I was talking about this company I invested in, and I said, well, we've been talking to, 4 media companies for the last 1 year. And he said, Brian, there are 500 retailers you can talk to.
Yeah.
Right? And which then suddenly just dawned on me, it's a much more exposure coefficient in terms of sheer number of customers that are out there.
Yeah, let me ask you this.
Go ahead, Dave. If I could interject on that point, just real quickly, if I could interject on that point. By comparison, the healthcare industry is a $300 billion industry, but at the end of the day, it's so consolidated that the technology buyers, there's maybe less than 500 people that determine what technology is being bought for that entire industry. Again, because, hospital chains, clinic chains, there's only so many companies compared to retail, which, as you say, there's 10,000, 20,000 retailers out there. In the healthcare industry, technology buyers, there's only 300 to 500 people making those decisions on what technology gets bought. So as far as the innovation cycle, no. If you're a startup, even though there's a lot of money there, it's just such a difficult place to get entry to. It's such a protected club, if you will.
Yeah, said Dave. Absolutely, you're spot on. Because in the media industry, it's even worse, right? There are 8 players. If you're in the carrier in the US, there are 4 players, right? And they're all consolidating, even with all the SEC and government regulations.
So that's
Brian,
go ahead, Ruben.
That's right. Hey, it's a great discussion. This is a topic that is very close to my heart as I invest in a lot of startups, how to reduce their capex and how do you reduce go to market, build the MVP quickly and show some value, then go and build under the hood stuff later. So one question from retail versus, I come from telcos, I come from many of these enterprise where there are bodies which define some standards, and based on the standards, for example, cell phone to CDMA to all of them, and then multiple people can come and build around it and all that.
So when you go to no code, to me, that is also important if to be able to interoperably play various features, various things, and you have that your company. So is there a body for retail where they are defining these standards to do this kind of explosive innovation going in?
It's a great question, Ruben. But I don't think when it comes to tech, the only organization that's doing a little bit of work in here is NRF, whatever, CIO, Council, and so on. But unlike in the carrier world, the standards, they don't necessarily set implementation and the tech standards per se. There are some high-level accepted best practices, but I don't think they set standards per se. Anybody in the audience who like to chime in on that, Jeff, or even anybody in the speaker side, in the listener side, any of you guys want to chime in on that? Love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the PCI compliance, which is a mandate being handed down by Visa and the credit card payment gateways. But that's just, hey, make sure that you're taking care of money, and it's self-reporting. So it's not like you can get in trouble. It's just Visa might get mad at you. But that's the only other standard I can think of.
I think it's also a good opportunity too, especially in the retail in terms of setting up technology standards. Anybody else? Thank you, Dave. That's yeah, I agree. Yeah. Any of you guys, Jeff, or even like anybody in the audience, you guys have any views, thoughts?
Let's see.
Look like I hit a sour point for the retail guys,
No, I think it's an opportunity. I think it's a very good question. I think it's a good opportunity, especially setting up standards in the carrier world. The whole GSM, right? Yeah. The IEME standards, the carrier locking,
ITU, International Telecommunication.
Exactly, telecommunication standards. Exactly, compression standards. So I think all that stuff, I think, is very critical. And I think even in the cable world, Cable Labs and all these guys have standards in the media world as well. But retail doesn't have a very clean standard like that. Jeff, what do you think this could be a nice retirement project for you?
If I have one more retirement project, Brian, I'm going to lose my mind. I've got enough right now, and you keep adding them to the pile. Brian, we probably have a couple minutes. Just curious, as we wrap up, what's the play for tier 2 and tier 3 retail with low code? I'm guessing they might even be a faster adopter, or what do what's your thinking?
See, I think low code is not a discriminating force. What I mean by that is because most low code platforms are very cost effective to use, and in fact, it will very well yield to tier 2 and tier 3 players, especially to tier 2 players, because they have the same set of broad use cases like the tier 1 players, maybe slightly lesser, but at the same time, even less workforce. So the upskilling there will play in a much stronger way, and you will see the benefits of low code, especially in tier 2.
And then how low can low go? Is it something that, so tier 2 typically is $1 billion down to 250 million, then tier 3 is 250 to 50 million. Does low code have a play at the tier 3 level?
See, I think tier 3 level will be mostly point solutions, and then existing platforms are going to provide built-in capabilities. And then these low code will be bound to those existing platforms, like, for example, Shopify and all these other type of big commerce, all these platforms that are all there will actually have this type of low code capabilities in their marketplace. So these tier 3s may not use low code as a platform within the company, but would be the beneficiaries of apps built on top of low code.
Okay, great. That's probably a pretty good place to wrap it up. Brian, any final thoughts on what a retailer should be looking at, what they should be thinking about?
No, I think, but just to kind of wrap it up, I think this is a serious revolution. We went through the numbers, and I think this actually allows retailers, leaders within retail to get to market faster, and also to upskill your workforce and be ready with sort of the forces of innovation that hits your industry, right? And I think there is a lot of value in this. So I would say read up on it, learn more about it. If you have any questions, feel free to ping Jeff or myself.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at Brian Sathianathan, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at Iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.